Hi, I'm here today live with Clint Smith, who is one of the most powerful voices speaking out against racism in America today. Clint Smith is an educator, a scholar, newly minted PhD from Harvard, Dr. Smith, author of an acclaimed poetry collection called Counting Dissent. He's also delivered two very, very widely viewed TED Talks on the importance of confronting structural racism and the experience of growing up Black in America. Clint joins me now to discuss ongoing protests against police killings, history of and persistence of structural racism in America, public policy, responses to police violence, and whatever else he wants to talk about. Clint, thank you for joining me.
I appreciate the invitation.
And congratulations on your doctorate. Even though
Thank
it's
you.
from Harvard and not from Berkeley.
It's I don't know that Berkeley would have let me in, but I appreciate it very much. It's still a surreal feeling.
Your doctorate, by the way, you and I were talking a little bit about just before we started about your experience in teaching in prisons, and I have always learned a lot from my students. What would you say you have learned in terms of the work that you have done from teaching people in prison?
Well, I think one of the things that I've learned most acutely is that, but for the arbitrary nature of birth and circumstance, it very easily could have been me behind those bars rather than somebody who gets to walk in and outside of them. I think sometimes people think that the things that we have or the things that we achieve or the statures or affiliations that we have are due to nothing but our hard work or due to nothing but the fact that we deserve them. But I think what has become clear for me in my several years of teaching in prisons is that I go in there every day and meet men and women whose lives were put on a fundamentally different trajectory, not because of anything they have done to deserve it, but because they were born into a set of circumstances, a set of social conditions that were the result of public policy that has existed for decades and decades of decades, that shaped the landscape of their community, that made it so that the trajectory of their lives went in one direction while the trajectory of my life went in another. And I think, had I been born into a different family, had I been born into a different neighborhood, had I been born to a different set of parents, it very easily could have ended up differently for me. And I meet men and women in there who are more brilliant, who are more talented, who are funnier, who are more thoughtful. And the fact that I've graduated with a PhD from Harvard is not because I've worked hard, but it is more reflective. It is equally as reflective of the fact that I have been put in circumstances that allow that hard work to manifest itself in certain ways, and that other people don't necessarily get the opportunity to be put in those same positions. And that's not to say that people don't have free will or agency, but it is to say that we have to contextualize from the places from which that agency emerges.
Well, contextualizing is exactly the issue with regard to structural racism. And there's a lot of discussion of structural racism or systemic racism right now. But why do you think it's been so difficult for the United States as a society to come to grips with structural racism? Is it because we are just so embedded in a culture of individualism that we can't see a system, or is it something else?
I think there's a lot of reasons. I mean, I think part of it is that white supremacy is so deeply ingrained into the DNA of this country. I think, so I always give this timeline because I think it's really helpful in grounding the conversation, right? So the first enslaved Africans were brought to the British colonies that would become America in 1619. The Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863. The Civil War ended in 1865. The Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were 1964 and 1965. The Federal Housing Act was signed in 1968. So it's only been about 50 years in which Black people in this country have even had a semblance of legal and legislative freedom. For 350 years prior to that, it was fundamentally legal to discriminate against, dehumanize, delegitimize, and disenfranchise Black people. Not in an interpersonal, somebody being mean and using the N-word, but like you are a state-sanctioned second-class citizen if you were considered a citizen at all. So if you were to kick somebody for 350 years and then ostensibly stop kicking them for a seventh of the amount of time that you spent kicking them, it would be both morally and intellectually disingenuous to then look at that group of people and be like, what's wrong with you? Why don't you have the same educational outcomes? Why don't you have the same academic outcomes? Why don't you have the same economic outcomes? Why is there so much violence and poverty saturating your communities? But we know the answers to these questions, right? And you don't even have to think, limit it to the context of slavery. You can think about an example being the New Deal, right? The New Deal I'll talk about all the time, I learned was the single greatest catalyst of intergenerational wealth over the course of the 20th century. It is responsible for creating the contemporary middle class. It is the thing that lifted millions of white families from poverty into homes in the suburbs, into college educations. And those things are true. What is also true is that Black people, and Ira Katz Nelson writes brilliantly about this in both The Fear Itself and When Affirmative Action Was White, talked about how the New Deal was constructed specifically and with the intention to keep Black people from having access to its most foundational benefits. So Black people, specifically Black people in the South, didn't have access to Social Security, minimum wage protection, housing mortgages, healthcare, GI Bill, union membership. And so you give the single greatest catalyst of intergenerational wealth over the course of a century to one group of people, and you don't give it to another group of people. And then people want to act surprised generations later when there are disparate outcomes along the lines that those resources have been allotted. And those, that is a microcosm of a much larger phenomenon in American history in which we create public policies that specifically have prevented Black people from accessing meaningful economic and social mobility. And then in 2020, people are like, why are Black people upset? Or why do Black people live disproportionately in poverty? Why are Black people disproportionately incarcerated? Why do Black people disproportionately do more poorly in school, right? And it is, if you don't understand that history, then you can fall into the trap of thinking that the reason one part of Washington, D.C. looks one way and another part of Washington, D.C. looks another way, or one part of San Francisco looks one way and another part of San Francisco looks another way, or New York, or any city in this country, you can think that it's because of the people in those communities rather than the things that have been done to those communities generation after generation after generation. And so part of it is a failure of education. But I think that failure of education is more deeply embedded in a certain story that this country wants to tell about itself, that has to do with American exceptionalism. But we don't often talk about how that American exceptionalism, for some, comes at the expense of a very real sort of oppression for others.
We don't want to talk about it, and that raises a kind of a deeper question, and that is why we don't want to talk about it, in the sense that, there are other countries. Germany, for example, modern Germany does require that all of the children in Germany visit the concentration camps of the Holocaust. The South African regime does have a peace and reconciliation commission. There's a sense that history is important for people to understand, and right. Even the dark side of a nation's history. You just mentioned Franklin D. Roosevelt. When I went to school, nobody mentioned the fact that FDR did not want to include household workers and farm workers, who were overwhelmingly Black people, right. Because he wanted to court the Southern Democrats. Why do we in this country refuse to understand our own racist history?
I think because so many people would see it as an indictment against the country would be understood as an indictment against ourselves. And I say ourselves broadly as Americans. I don't necessarily include myself in that as a Black American, because I think that obviously my relationship to these histories and these policies is fundamentally different in some ways. But what you used Germany, for example. And so I'm writing a book and finishing a book right now called How the Word is Passed. And it's about different historical sites across the country and how they reckon with or fail to reckon with their relationship to the history of slavery. And one of the places that I go is Angola Prison. So Angola Prison is the largest maximum security prison in the country in southern Louisiana. And it has 70 to 80% of the people incarcerated there are Black men. And it is on top of a former plantation. If you were to go to Germany, and you had the largest maximum security prison in Germany, and it was on top of a former concentration camp, and 70 to 80% of its occupants were Jewish, it would be a global emblem of anti-Semitism. It would be so deeply unacceptable. It would be an affront to all of our moral sensibilities. People would be protesting outside of it every day, and they should. It would be unfathomable. And yet in the United States, we have the largest maximum security prison in the country in Louisiana that is on top of a former plantation, multiple plantations, and 70 some odd % of the people in there are Black. And we accept it as a feature of our prison system, as a feature of our society, as a feature of our country. And what is it about white supremacy that both enacts violence against people's bodies, Black people's bodies, but also numbs us to things that should otherwise be wildly unacceptable and wildly offensive? And I think that, in this country, we are so committed to the idea of American exceptionalism that we suppress anything that makes us look unexceptional, right? We want to talk about how Thomas Jefferson represents the best of our American ideals and aspirations and was this brilliant, brilliant man. But we don't want to talk about the fact that he owned 600 people, that he enslaved his own children, right? Like, and what does it mean to walk through the world holding those complicated truths together, right? That Thomas Jefferson was both the person who helped draft the Declaration of Independence, and he is also someone who, enslaved his own children. And both of those things are true, right? He was brilliant, and he was also deeply racist. He was somebody who, was the governor of the state of Virginia, the third president of the United States. And he is also someone who wrote in Notes on the State of Virginia, which is his memoir, his manifesto. He says, Blacks are inherently inferior to white people in both endowments of body and mind. He says the slave is incapable of love, incapable of possessing or sustaining complex emotion. And we fail to teach in ways that demand that we hold those realities at the same time. So instead, we just suppress one of them and lift up the other.
So do you think that what we are going through right now, in terms of something of a reckoning with this past, do you think that will change what we've been talking about? That is our amnesia or our clinging to American exceptionalism, not seeing our racist past, do you think it actually, when we talk about structural systemic racism, that means doing something more than simply taking down statues of Confederate leaders and actually changing public policies systemically?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I don't think that those are mutually exclusive, right? So, I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana, and the sort of iconography of the Confederacy was an ever-present fixture of my life. I walked down streets, named after Robert E. Lee. I went past schools named after Jefferson Davis. Tulane University is named after someone who owned slaves. There are over 100 street signs, statues, names of buildings in New Orleans that are named after former Confederate soldiers or former slaveholders. And it is, what is true is that those places should not exist. The Confederacy existed singularly to maintain and perpetuate and expand the institution of slavery. And they wrote it. You can read all the declarations of Confederate secession. They were not at all ambiguous about this. They're kind of like, da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da. This is about slavery. This is why we're leaving, right? Like, they're not unclear. So those statues should not exist. They should not, if they exist, they should exist in a place, in a museum, in a separate location, where they can be reckoned with in ways that are appropriate, not lifted up on pedestals and paid for by the public's tax dollars. So I think that is true. And those symbols can't be disentangled from policies, right? So like if we look at the times in which those monuments were erected, which was largely the early 20th century and during the civil rights movement, they were put up specifically with the intention to terrorize Black communities and to reassert notions of white supremacy in moments where it felt like Black people were achieving some sort of political or social mobility. And those statues served as both symbols and reminders and catalysts to policies throughout Jim Crow, through the early 20th century to the mid 20th century, that were profoundly harmful to Black people. And I think what is true is that, you have to do both. And in terms of policy, what I'm interested in is the ways in which people have to account for and reckon with the way that white supremacy benefits them in their lives in ways that they might not be fully aware of or fully cognizant of, or that they might think of themselves as thoughtful, progressive, liberal people. But when we talk about changing zoning laws that might make it so that multifamily units can be built in your neighborhood, which, and these like single family homes, what we know from the relationship between race and wealth, are proxies for keeping certain people out of communities. What does it mean if a school is attempting to create integration efforts that are going to bring more Black and Latinx children who are living in poverty into the school? Are you going to be like some of these folks in New York and other places across the country who are ostensibly liberal people, but then show up to the school board meeting and say, this is unacceptable. We don't want these people in our school because the quality of the school is going to go down, or the safety of our kids is going to be at risk. And so I think it demands that people consider the way that the way that society has been built to make it seem as if certain things that certain people have are natural rather than coming at the expense of other groups of people, and that seeking to create a more equitable landscape of opportunities should not simply be understood as taking something away from people, but redistributing redistributing resources in a way that is more aligned with the values that people seem to espouse.
Well, that's really the issue, it seems to me, Clint, right now. That is, it's easy to print Black Lives Matter on 16th Street. It's easy to take down Confederate statues. But if you're talking about getting rid of exclusionary zoning, or cash bail, or redlining, or payday lending, or mass incarceration, right, that's really hard to do. And how do you get from the symbolic, to the really hard work of systemic change?
It's, there's not a simple answer. I mean, part of it is, I think we see this in the conversation right now around police abolition or defund the police, right? And I think that part of what happens is that some people will hear that slogan, or they see that and they immediately dismiss it without actually engaging with the substance of the idea. And they'll say, oh, that's unrealistic. I can't even begin to consider that, because we need the police. We obviously need the police, right? But even that sentiment, this idea that like we need the police, is not part of. To step back, I think I'm interested in if we're going to expand our capacity for empathy, I think it also means that we have to expand our willingness to unlearn so many of the things that we have assumed are sort of natural orders of society, right? And so, for example, when we think of police abolition, it is not simply that people who are prison abolition and police abolition, prison abolitionists, prison abolitionists and police abolitionists want to just get rid of prisons and police like tomorrow and let everybody out, right? What it is a process of like fundamental reinvestment, and saying we invest billions and billions of dollars into police, we invest billions and billions of dollars into prisons. What does it look like to take the billions of dollars that we invest in these places and to invest them into social infrastructure, and to invest them into community organizations, to invest them into the things that make it so that people don't find themselves in a position where they are proximate to crime, where they are proximate to where they feel a sense of desperation. Because what we know that the vast majority of people who are incarcerated come from circumstances in which they were living in or adjacent to poverty. And if you can create circumstances that strip away poverty, and that chip away at poverty, and that make it so that people have the jobs they need, have the healthcare they need, have the mental health services they need, the list goes on and on. If you create a society that is building up those type parts of our social infrastructure, it makes the need for the police or the need for prisons increasingly less relevant. And so I think people hear defund the police, or they hear police abolition, and they think of it as like a negative project, rather than one that is predicated on building something up and lifting something up and investing in people, rather than investing in organizations and institutions that, for as long as they have existed to terrorize, lock up, harm Black people, right? Like we cannot disentangle the history of enslavement from the origins of prison. We cannot disentangle it from the origins of slave patrols, from the origins of the police. And so I think it is hard to reimagine, or it's hard to imagine a society that you have not seen before, but it is one people before us have done for hundreds of years, right? Like what we try to do is build a world that we deserve, and build a world in which people don't feel like their tax dollars are going to an organization and an institution that have perpetually terrorized them for their entire lives, and their parents' entire lives, and their grandparents' entire lives. And so I think everyone should approach this moment with a level of empathy, with a level of humility, and with a willingness to step into conversations and think about things in ways that you might not necessarily have been willing to do so beforehand.
Well, let's talk about empathy and humility and listening. because it seems to me that it is relatively easy for white America to say, okay, maybe a few less dollars for police and more for social services in your community, in your town. That doesn't really mean I have to sacrifice much, doesn't mean I have to change my attitudes with regard to NIMBY or exclusionary zoning or, even mass incarceration. But the next step, when I really, as a white person, have got to change not only my attitudes, but I've got to embrace a kind of change. And I've got to make sacrifices, at least I think they are, or to me, they may seem like sacrifices in order to embrace a very, very different kind of world. How do you suppose we then move in that direction? How do we use this time of reckoning to get white America to see that things that white America is clinging to, and again, I'm using exclusionary zoning and NIMBYism just as an example, that they are actually perpetuating a system that is bad for all of us.
Well, part of what I am heartened by the evolution of the discourse and specifically of the evolution of the public discourse over the last 5 years. So if we think about where the conversation was when Trayvon Martin was killed, or when Michael Brown was killed, or when Eric Garner was killed, or when Renisha McBride was killed. If we think about where the conversation was in 2013, 14, 15, redlining was felt new to many people, right? Like when Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote The Case for Reparations, it felt he was writing about something that so few people in the public discourse were engaging with. Scholars had been talking about this for a long time, activists had been talking about it for a long time, but it wasn't part of mainstream discussion. Like people weren't talking about the impact that housing segregation has on shaping the contemporary landscape of inequality. But I think what has happened because of writers and thinkers and activists and organizers over the last 6 years, and you can see it in public opinion polls, right? The way people's understanding of the manifestations of racism has shifted and evolved and become more sophisticated. And to be sure, like some of it, some people say systemic racism and like are just paying it lip service and don't actually engage with the substance of what that is or what it looks like. But I think the fact that, when we say redlining or when we talk about housing segregation or when we say the phrase systemic racism, that the conversation is beginning in a fundamentally different place. So I do think there has been movement, and it is heartening because I think in this moment, there is a different type of reckoning and there is a different type of potential willingness that some people have to learn about and think about things that they might not otherwise have thought. I think that I just recently did an event with several thousand teachers from across the country, specifically social studies and history teachers, and I'm so moved by how many people are thinking about all of the different parts of who are interrogating the history textbooks they use, who are interrogating what they're teaching, what they're not teaching, right? Like I didn't learn about exclusionary practices in the New Deal and FDR working with the Dixiecrats and leaving the farm workers and the household workers out, which was 75% of Black people in the South at that time, right? I didn't learn about that till my first year of graduate school, right? And it shouldn't take me going to grad school to learn about something that was foundational to the American project. And so, this should be embedded in the social studies and history textbooks that our students are engaging with. So I think, with teachers and activists and lawyers and people in boardrooms, and there is we are in a moment in which I think people are taking it more seriously, and in a moment in which there's a different type of movement, and there are also different resources because of what happened 5 years ago. More Black writers and more people writing into the experiences of Black people in this country have come. There's more literature and more research in the ecosystem, and I think that part of the reason that the New York Times bestseller list last week and the last 2 weeks has been largely books about racism is because there are those books have been published in the last 5 years in a way I don't think they were necessarily being published before, giving people a new opportunity to do so. And at the end of the day, to bring it home is people have to be willing to do the work themselves, right? Like there is plenty of research, there are plenty of books, there's plenty of podcasts and YouTube videos and articles that can tell you about all of this stuff. It's a matter of how willing someone is to proactively engage in the substance of these things themselves.
Well, that's really the heart of it, isn't it, Clint? I mean, as you and I speak right this minute, the president of the United States is there at the White House giving a news conference in which he's announcing that his support of legislation that is going to make tiny, tiny little changes, maybe with some luck, in police departments. But you and I are now talking about fundamental changes in how people think. And that would include not only legislative changes, but it would include changes in terms of bank lending practices. We were talking about redlining a moment ago, and I was thinking about a study I just read that the major banks in the United States, the major Wall Street banks, are still giving or charging higher interest rates on mortgages to Black people than to white people. That is a form of redlining, but we don't even know about it. I mean,
Right.
we have to have a habit of inquiry in this time of reckoning that forces and urges and encourages all of us to find out things that we did not know about and maybe did not even want to know about. And that is perhaps the biggest challenge.
Absolutely. And I think that part of what is true of this moment and this movement is that it truly is an intersectional moment, and that it is led by people with an intersectional feminist framework, right? So for all of us have to reckon with and think about the multiple identities that we carry. So for me, I exist in this world as a Black, straight, cisgender man, right? Like those are three parts of my identity. So as a Black man, as a Black person, I exist as part of a group of people who have been historically oppressed. As a straight cisgender man, I exist as part of that has historically done the oppressing, right? And so if I'm truly, the same way we think about what it means to be anti-racist, we have to think actively about what it means to be anti-sexist, what it means to be anti-homophobic, actively anti-homophobic, what it means to be actively anti-transphobic. And it is not on people in those groups to educate me on the ways that I can be a better ally to those communities. It demands that I do research on my own, that I do learning on my own. And it also is not something that happens overnight, right? I think people can fall into the trap of thinking like you cross some threshold and now you're good, or now you understand, or now you're, I hate the nomenclature of woke because it's almost a caricature of itself now. But if we were going to use that framework, right, like people are like, oh, are you woke, or is the person not woke? I think it's unhelpful for a lot of reasons, but part of it is because it suggests that like once you cross this woke threshold, now you're good and you've done the work. When actually it is an ongoing process of learning and unlearning that happens throughout the rest of your life, right? So it is not simply that you donate to an organization or you put up something on your social media and then when this moment kind of fizzles out, then you are done and you are an anti-racist person. Being an anti-racist, being an anti-sexist, being an anti-homophobe, all of these things demand ongoing proactive work. And it is messy and it is clumsy and it is hard and you will likely mess up. But I think the paralysis and the fear that comes from not wanting to mess up or do the wrong thing or say the wrong thing, if that is what is preventing you from engaging in the work of unlearning so many of these systems and realities themselves, then you're doing a disservice to yourself and you're doing a disservice to the project of like building a better world that we all have to be actively involved in.
So becoming an anti-racist, and I know I promised you just a half hour of your time, and you've already given us just about more than that. But becoming an anti-racist, Clint Smith, is more than presumably assuaging white guilt about the past. And it is more, presumably, than just being open to learning. It is actually a matter of eagerly embracing learning, not only about the past, but about what is happening right now, and might even embrace activist change, that is, becoming an activist for the purpose of seeking and getting a more just society. That's a big, big order, but it seems appropriate. Am I wrong?
No, I think that's absolutely true. And I think that it demands humility, as we talked about before. Like if you are unsettled by the calls for the police abolition, if you find yourself unsettled or made uncomfortable by the tactics that some activists use, if you find yourself feeling personally indicted by, the way that people are talking about the whiteness in this country. I think what we all need is a level of introspection, and what we all need is a level of thoughtfulness that just allows us to slow down and say, well, why would somebody be like called to disband the police? Like, what is happening in their experience and in their lives and in the things that they witness that would make them feel that, rather than dismissing it out of hand, right? Like, so if you are, so many Black people grow up in communities in which, like, the only experience they have had with police, to use that as an example, is like the police get out of their car, they stop you, they search you, they throw you against the wall and just harass you, and they harass your friends, and they've done that every day of your life. And so, one day the police come, they get out of their car, they tell you to get against the wall, and you're sick and tired of being harassed for not doing anything. And so you run, and then the police chase you, and then something happened, you turn around and they say you turned around with a gun, but you just turned around and it was your hand, or it was your wallet, or whatever the case may be. And they shoot you, and people are like, well, why did you run? Why did you resist arrest? Like, why would you if you had just, not done anything, then nothing would have happened. But that doesn't account for the fact that these forces have been, institutions of harassment and terror in these communities for a long time. So, even the man in Atlanta who was just killed, people are like, why did he resist arrest? Why did he try to run? If your experience with what police have done is at all, is shaped by the fact that they are a terrorist organization in your community and feel like one. And if, it is not enough to say, don't run or don't resist arrest. I mean, we just saw what happened to George Floyd, right? We just saw what happened to Breonna Taylor. Breonna Taylor was literally asleep in her home. So, we need to disabuse ourselves of this idea that if you don't run or stand still or don't resist arrest, that you'll be fine. I just think it demands people, it's a proactive empathy. It's not something that empathy isn't something that is cultivated just by sitting there. It demands learning. It demands listening. It demands thinking about experiences that exist beyond your own, and taking those seriously, and saying that what this institution represents to me might be fundamentally different than what it represents to somebody else. And how much of what I even imagine this institution to be, how much of what I imagine policing to be, is not necessarily even shaped by my own experiences with police, but is shaped by a narrative around policing that is so embedded in the DNA of this country that I'm unable to think of them outside of that context.
Well, changing the DNA of the country is what we're really talking about. And you've got 2 kids, you told me.
I do.
And by the time your children are maybe in their late 20s, early 30s, around your age, do you expect that they are going to be living in a country that is fundamentally different from America today in the ways we've been talking about?
I don't know. I don't think any of us know. I hope so. And I know that I feel so moved and heartened that there are thousands, that there are millions of people around this country who are working to build a better world for my kids and for their own kids and for themselves. The example I always give is I think about social change as a big stone concrete wall, and you're chipping away at it, and you're chipping away. And the thing is, you don't know how big the wall is or how wide the wall is. The wall could end in a couple inches, or it could end in 100 yards, but you don't know. All you know is that you're chipping away at the wall the best you can. And you keep chipping away, and then you pass, and somebody comes behind you, and they chip, and they chip, and they chip. And it's intergenerational work, right? When we think about slavery existed for 250 years in this country. There were people fighting against slavery and fighting for the abolition of slavery since it began in this country. And the vast, vast, vast majority of people who fought against enslavement throughout their lives never got to see emancipation. They never got to see the abolition of slavery. Does that mean their work was in vain? No. What it means is that their work was chipping away at this proverbial wall and created opportunities for the next generation to come and continue chipping away, and the next generation to come and continue chipping away. So, when I don't do this work, or any of us shouldn't, I don't think, necessarily do this work for ourselves or so that we can see the fruits of its labor. We're doing it because somebody at some point will, right? Will I see the end of mass incarceration in my lifetime? I don't know. It would be nice. I hope to, but I'm not counting on it, but I'm not doing it so that I can see it. I'm doing it so that at some point somebody will be able to, whether or not that's my kids or their kids or their kids.
Well, we will continue to chip away. You will, Clint Smith, Dr. Clint Smith, and I assure you that I will. And our children will probably continue to chip away. And hopefully what we are all going through right now is a reckoning that permits us and encourages us to do even more chipping. And educator, scholar, author, poet, now doctor, thank you for spending your time with us.
Thank you so much.